I'm so happy to be with you again. I need to share with you thoughts about authenticity in interpretation. And this is something that I'm confronted daily with my teaching, because the pieces come alive even if they're from the past, with a presence that is making them as if they were just composed by us today. Of course we can't, but we pretend. And to a certain extent, the interpretation and the improvisation in portions that were divided or decided by the composer for the performers of the time period when interpretation included improvisation, like a cadenza, but in a solo piece too, comes to the point, am I allowed? No, you shouldn't. In fact, when I think about, let's say, Haydn sonata, it's not just to play it on the modern piano, it's also to hear it the way Haydn heard it within the ecosystem of his time period, and making abstraction from all the modern music we've heard since then. Inevitably so. Equitonal, microtonal, supertonal, non-tonal, bitonal, serial, etc. Or any other variation or customization of tonality by a given composer to, in fact, translate in music what they had to say as a message. Is it just atmospheric, or was it with a specific program in mind? Nevertheless, I find it fascinating because the audacities of the past don't appear to be audacious today. And so we have to artificially think, oh, if Haydn wrote an accent on the weak 16th notes instead of the downbeat, is that he's provocative, he's humorous, he's ironic, he's joking, he's laughing. And of course, how do we find that so audacious today? We have to immerse ourselves in his time period. What music he was hearing, what music was the music of their past that they knew. In other words, be able to share the specific language with its audacities of the day today. So it's almost like travel back in time, regardless if we don't use the instrument of the day. In fact, if you use a fortepiano of Haydn's time, you would think that in fact it tells you what it can do in action, in the repeated notes, etc. Legato. And you could think that perhaps had Haydn be able to be here today, he would find that this type of instrument that we have today access to enhances everything too much. The length of sound, the volume, contrasts, the perhaps to the detriment of the articulation and the subtle interior elements of subphrasing. But on the other hand, I find that if we do an intelligent translation from the instruments of his time, therefore the way of hearing the music besides playing it, and playing it today the way we hear after we have heard in Romantic era music and early modern music and contemporary music and all kinds of genres and styles which inevitably explore new alphabets, new languages that we have to learn in order to access them. So the universality of the tonal system is no more in place, because you have to sort of immerse yourself intellectually in the music language of a given composer in order to appreciate it, perhaps be moved by it or admire it. But you cannot hear it without preparation. It's like every language is spoken by each human being you meet differently, and so you can't have a common language. Even if speaking all the same language, you still don't get full understanding, because people understand differently the meaning of words in the past or today or even today. So let's less the past. And I found that fascinating, because in a way we betray them with love when we play them on the modern piano. And give you an example. In the last movement of the E-flat major sonata by Haydn, he starts the repeated notes. Then he stops and he starts a step above. So by itself is funny, because he could have gone. When will he stop? So by itself, that is a comic effect. But what is interesting is that the upbeat is equal to the downbeat, and the notes are repeated purposely. So they give you a sense, as a listener without the score, that you don't know where is the downbeat. If I give you an impulse on the downbeat, you'll hear. Now I'm explicit in my interpretation. I sort of pinpoint to you, this is the pulse. Ta-ta-ya, ta-ta-ti-ya. But if I play equally the upbeat and the downbeat without any impulse accent, I don't feel where is the beat until the harmonization comes. 1-5-1 on the ostinato of Mi flat. So you could make a crescendo and give the impulse on the final sol or G, which is on the downbeat, where the left hand plays the tonic. So he doesn't say you have to be explicit. That's too explicit. And if you do, and between these two and restarting, there was an improvisational cadenza. And we don't know if they did as much, or if they did everywhere, or somewhere. It was the discretion and the taste of the performer. Was it just a technical pattern of broken thirds from the toolbox, or the six, or was it thematical? Enhancing the idea rather than only making it decorative, vocalise. Okay, we don't know, but we guess. So nevertheless, today, can't forget it. People who study music is to recite, typewrite, sorry for the term, perform, or text. And therefore, if anything is so special about jazz and Baroque is that the beauty of the performers then, in terms of aesthetic beauty, is to be different, creative. How does such and such jazz pianist decorate, arrange, improvise, recompose, re-improvise rather, on the spot, the given tune of another jazz musician? And will be appreciated for the way it's different rather than the alikeness, which is for classical pianists the competition system where everybody plays the same edition, the same notes, and possibly only clean, and that's the lowest denominator. And okay, even within this idea that through text we all don't make, let's say, some kind of eccentric differentiations through the score, the notes, the texture, the notes, the very notes. We can still have a different interpretation by the accents, the impulse, perhaps the crescendo, the dynamics, the phrasing, but still reciting the notes of the score and the original text. That's why I spoke in the beginning of our meeting about how to transmit authenticity without to try to imitate the authenticity on the modern piano, as if I'm trying to say, okay, on the forte piano, the length of sound, the speed of articulation for the lifting of the keys. In a slow movement, they might have taken less slow because of the length of sound being shorter in their decay. And the fast movements, they might have played it faster because they had a lighter touch, less deep action in the keys, but also less loud when it's profoundly louder. So you can compare and contrast, but when you play, you play. So you don't play apologetically on the piano saying, if I were on the pianoforte of his time, I would have done this, or fortepiano. No, you have to make it for what it is, on what you play, and play it with this conviction as if you're making it. Well, no, you're not making it up, but you have to be believably so, making music as if you are creating it. Not as if you recite somebody's edition of somebody's piece and trying to stay to the minimum allowed in order to not stick out. Whenever in Baroque or in jazz, the improvisation is part of the personality of the customization of the piece. We're not allowed that anymore. It used to be the case with Busoni and the great transcribers like Liszt, who took an opera aria or a Bach piece and transformed it into extravaganza, which today, if done in the same spirit, would be considered by the musical world of classical music a heresy. So within the constraints of the notes of the score, you can still express yourself in a certain way. You can enhance some elements, either voicing, either rhythmic pulse, and so that you can customize and become convincing in it. At least you should sound convincing. Even if you can change mind in between interpretations, because nothing is set in stone. Of course, the score is, but in between the lines. If you have to take a slow movement, you be careful not to play too slow. If you play a fast movement, you have to play it fast enough until the articulation is crisp and articulated, or then slurred, or it is decorative for the left hand. It sounds busy, loud, heavy, thick, because they must have heard with the gut strings and the leather hammers tops. It's not like today with the steel strings and the felt head of the hammers. So they must have had this kind of thinner, lighter sound, more like a harp with organ with the pedal, so to say, combination. And the forte, in the tutti representing in the left hand, and this is the decorative diva singing on the piano imitation of vocalese. But if you take it at face value, it says forte for both hands. It doesn't say for which hand, if ever. So if you take it at face value, and you have to play heavy, thick, and articulated and toccata-like in a modern sense of the word. Each 16th note. It ends up sounding angry. Now, there is a contrast between the cunning, playful, undetermined upbeat, repeated note melody. Could have been. Obviously not. That was the playfulness, to have a melodic note repeated. And then you have to, I think, play very light and crisp, and then the left hand forte with a kind of bow for a cellist. And I think that at this point, yes, you translate a little bit more attentive to the balance between the different hands, obviously in this case ranges. The straight strung piano had separate ranges in different timbres almost, not so much homogenized as a cross-strung pianos do today. So you have to be careful, therefore, not to be thick when you want to be loud. So it's not just a dynamic volume, loud and soft, like as if it was a button. It's more about the texture, the heaviness of the articulation, and the tempo, and how much of it blends without to become overly blending and then becomes blurry. So you do have in mind, when you try to play the texture, how to in fact reorganize the assets that you have for the transparent and readable texture. It's like an intelligent reading of the score rather than just the reading of the score itself. I find that fascinating. And I find that necessary to also think about the pedal on the modern piano. And if you observe some of the pedalings that are notated by the composer or his publisher, perhaps without or with the consent of the composer. Anyway, many composers didn't write the pedaling per se. It was either harmonic, the dominant, the tonic, and then the good taste again of the performer to know how to modulate the amount of pedaling and how much residue of resonance to keep according to the acoustic. In other words, you have to be also adapting it to the spot, to the place, to the instrument, and to the acoustic, and therefore all of this is to the hearing. It all goes down to the hearing. How do we hear this piece? And therefore, if we know what kind of soundscape we want, what kind of thinness or thickness, what kind of dynamic range, what kind of balance between the two hands, what kind of tempo for the clarity or the blurry effect, with or without pedal, articulation details, all of a sudden you have those parameters to choose from, to organize in, that are all piloted, monitored by the ear. Of course, the fingers learn by practicing a sort of a muscular memory technique, and also the pitch. Of course, we don't tune the pianos ourselves, most of us. This is in E flat major, but in fact, if it was in E major, we'd have a different combination of topography of the terrain of the keyboard, the white and the black keys. So the fingerings would be different. 2 3 1 2 3, or 2 3 1 2 4, 1 2 3 4, or the more white keys, the more consecutive fingers, and agility of the thumb passing under the hand. I mean, think about it. Haydn composed these late sonatas in London when he attended the wedding of one of his students, and he was lodged in front of the Broadwood company of pianoforte at the time making, the manufacturers, and he tested them out of curiosity, I assume, and he realized that compared to the Stein fortepianos in Vienna, which are more thin sounding and more intimate, perhaps more accompaniment-like, Streicher, another Viennese piano maker, a little bit bigger sound, but the Broadwood for him, for then, was like a symphonic orchestra piano with an incredible enhanced capacity of colors, and compared to what he knew in Vienna. And he composed this kind of symphonic sonatas compared to his earlier sonatas in Vienna, which are more like trio sonatas or minuets. Excitement of the fullness of the sound, and of course the contrast. And typical in Haydn, he always adds rests in between the sounds, like as if you're taken by surprise and your attention is even directed more because it's an interruption. And again. later, not that many, Beethoven would write the Pathetic Sonata in the early 19th century, using the punched chord, the percussive chord, rich in tone. Whenever Mozart, who was not yet fully fortepiano composer, especially in his earlier sonatas for keyboard, we have the arpeggiated chords which come from the tradition of the harpsichord, where you display the resonance of the sounds one after the other rather than bunching them all. Because of the plucked instrument style, it cancels each other, all these sounds. Whenever in the percussive chord you can hear them all at the same time project against almost violently for the time period. Or Bach in his Partita in C minor does which was written for the harpsichord, and Beethoven for the fortepiano. But C.P. Bach, and especially Carl Philipp Emanuel, exactly, or Christian Bach, the latest last son composer of Bach, within the Haydn transmission of Baroque into what we call the Viennese or first school, the classical school. They really transformed to write, and Beethoven will completely develop this directly on the fortepiano, for the fortepiano, specifically because of the fortepiano, of its name's expression by dynamic contrast range. And therefore we lose the idea of the arpeggiation. It wouldn't come to mind, right? Anachronism. But between Bach's death in 1750, which is the middle of the 18th century, obviously, and Chopin's death in 1849, only 99 years separated this enormous passage from Baroque through classical to Romantic era. In fact, they all overlapped, not only because most of the composers are last lived short and died in their 30s, but not all, but mostly, but also because it was an ever-growing, developing and transformational sound production for the piano writing as an instrument, as its own repertoire. 32 sonatas by Beethoven. None of them is for harpsichord or fortepiano. They're for fortepiano right away, and he, of course, visionary writes things that are even beyond what the fortepiano could do. In a way, perhaps, or not only because he was deaf later in his life, he's idealized the production of sound the piano could do. But it was not his job to be thinking about the limitations of the instrument if he found any. It was his job to write something, and then, regardless if it's practical or not, like a fortepiano on the same note, which is unfeasible on the piano, he still writes it down, and he, in a way, tells us, deal with it. So intelligently or realistically, or changing it a little bit in order to get that. I'm confronted constantly teaching the composer's wishes or ideas or DNA thought process filtered through their notation, which is more or less precise and more or less published and edited by the publishers. Then, as a hyphen, I am between the composers, dead ones, and the young students who ask questions naturally to understand how to apprehend the music, I would say, music world, the ecosystem in this case. And so we have to define how to interrupt the sound, how to voice or not, and how to breathe, and how not to put pedal on passing tones. So a mezzo forte in Haydn is not a mezzo forte in Beethoven or Schubert. It's thicker in Beethoven, it's thinner in Haydn, is more vulnerably, beautifully strong in Schubert, but not that much symphonic, but within, it's so much of beautiful subtleties, innuendos, that you can highlight or suggest to your interpretation. It's almost as if you sculpt with your hands through the keyboard, even not touching directly the sound that you produce like most other instruments. You feel like you're becoming some kind of a sculptor of this vanishing music that you create as soon as the decay happens. But in between the exhaling sound, you manage to do something. You cannot do a vibrato like a string or voice instrument, or a wind instrument, but you can still enhance it a little bit with the pedal and still try to bring it to the extent of the direction of the line of the meaning of what you want to say, not just color for color, sound for sound, effect for effect, forte for forte, piano, mezzo forte, mezzo piano, fortissimo, pianissimo. It's more about where the line and the musical thought and idea leads to, in your opinion, and you bring the attention of the listener as if you take them by the hand and you bring them on a walk with you and say, look at this flower, look at this plant, look at this light, look at this reflection on the water. It's basically a narrative storytelling, but of course at the base we have to define the soundscape, like the landscape of the painting, with the colors and the proportions, and keep ourselves stylistically to note. With Haydn, we have very short cuts. Every chord, every note, when there's a rest, has to be very short and breathing. You cannot just linger and stay longer and let it resonate. That you do mostly in the Romantic later era. So even if you play it on the same instrument, you have to play the different styles according to your understanding or culture of what you learned or studied or read about it. But you can't imitate the old instrument, and then you have to create your imaginary old instrument in your mind through your ears, and then with the help of the teacher who gives you incentive and say, dare that, but don't do this, careful about this, don't overdo this, the pedal, the shortness, the air, the breath, especially the rests, which are very part of the expression. And then you try to say, okay, I'm going to start with the Haydn sonata, I'm going to play later perhaps the Chopin sonata or a Scriabin sonata on the same piano, but it will sound like 3 different pianos according to what I'm going to control with my sculpting fingers. Staccato is 2 by 2, and legato by more than 2, almost 4. And of course, sometimes we think, okay, I play the piano as well, play it as if it's written for the piano. You can't do that. You have to be constantly aware of the guidelines of the soundscape of the composer's style. And then you enter in this equation between how the composer heard the music and how you will hear it in order to play it for the audience listening to it. In other words, you're sort of the preparer and the sharer. I find that very enriching, because then the practicing becomes not boring repetitivity only, although it's necessary for technical things. You have to practice. That I agree, it's not fun. But if you're driven, you understand that you have to master the details technically in order to express yourself artistically. But then you have at the same time to develop an artistic understanding of the piece, meaning a storytelling, how you dress up the whole music that you present. Then you have articulations, but you have ornamentations, and you have decorations, and you have improvisations, and you have fermatas, and you have rubato, and you have all kinds of effects that you can use very little or some and somewhere and not elsewhere, and that's where you need the guiding of the teacher. And then even if you disagree with the teacher later after you perform it, or you perform it yourself, you keep some things from different places that you received it from. It doesn't have to be the teacher only. It's very humbling, because we just suggest, at least I do, with firm belief, and want to give the chance so that when my students are heard in juries, other musicians who hear them appreciate their culture of sound preparation and their determination, regardless if their stage fright makes them make mistakes, because that's what happens, more or less or more. But beyond and besides the dictatorship of the wrong note as a common denominator for establishing who plays how, there is also the structure, the organization, basically be the conductor of your orchestra yourself. ephemeral architecture of the piece that you display, and that reveals itself differently every time you play it, perhaps not fully, but in details. And you have to adapt to the unexpected. The keyboard doesn't respond the way you expect on this piano or that piano. You will never play mostly on the same piano. Well, mostly never. But you try to reorganize on each piano a little bit of what you have in your Soundscape ear. Easy to say all that, isn't it? It's so difficult to sit on the pilot seat and do it in real time and not speak. But teaching is verbalizing the untold, or over-explaining the hint of the subtle innuendos that the composer has embedded in the piece. That's why I think, as I'm sure most teachers think, you learn from your students rediscovering the piece next to them. Very humbling and very exciting. Thank you.